The morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows of Sterling Holdings, a symbol of glass, steel, and ambition that towered above the heart of the city. Inside the top-floor office, the air was crisp, the silence deliberate, and every inch of the room reflected the man who ruled it. Daniel Sterling, the 34-year-old CEO whose name carried weight in every boardroom and whose presence commanded silence even among his most senior executives, sat behind a polished oak desk reviewing quarterly projections that could make or break million-dollar ventures. He was a man who believed in logic, order, and control. His crisp navy suit, tailored to perfection, mirrored his personality, structured, precise, and devoid of unnecessary emotion. To him, everything and everyone had a purpose, and if something did not serve efficiency or progress, it was irrelevant. Love, family, feelings, all these were luxuries he had long dismissed as distractions. Across the room, his longtime attorney and confidant Vincent Cross stood holding a brown leather portfolio, his usual confidence weighed down by unease. Daniel barely noticed until Vincent cleared his throat, his voice hesitant as if choosing each word with care. "Daniel," he began quietly, "we need to talk about your grandfather's will." Daniel did not look up. His eyes remained fixed on the glowing tablet screen before him, his fingers moving with practiced precision. "The will?" he replied coldly. "That was settled 2 years ago." Vincent took a slow breath. "Not entirely. There's a clause that becomes active today, and it concerns you directly." That made Daniel pause. Slowly, he placed the tablet on the desk, his piercing gray eyes lifting to meet Vincent's. "Explain." "The clause states that to maintain full control of Sterling Holdings," Vincent said, sliding the document across the desk, "you must be married, Weston, and remain married, for a minimum of 30 days before your 35th birthday. Otherwise, controlling interest reverts to the board." The words hit Daniel like an insult to his intelligence. His jaw tightened and he rose from his chair, pacing toward the panoramic window that overlooked the sprawling cityscape. The skyline stretched endlessly, a kingdom he had conquered through sleepless nights, ruthless decisions, and unshakable discipline. Marriage, the very concept, felt like a childish trap. "This is absurd," he muttered, his voice low but laced with irritation. "My grandfather knew I had no interest in such nonsense." Vincent's tone softened. "He also knew you, Daniel. He believed that power without compassion destroys itself. He wanted you to understand that some lessons can't be learned from balance sheets." Daniel turned sharply, his expression unreadable. "And if I refuse?" "Then the company goes to the board," Vincent said firmly. "And you lose everything your grandfather built, and everything you've spent your life protecting." For a long moment, silence filled the office. Daniel's mind worked like a machine, calculating, assessing, rejecting emotion. It was many things, but foolish wasn't one of them. Losing the company wasn't an option. Finally he spoke, each word measured and controlled. "Find me a candidate," he said flatly. "Someone who understands this is purely contractual. No emotions, no complications, no illusions." Vincent nodded, though his eyes carried doubt. "I'll draw up the terms." But fate, as it often does, had already chosen someone Daniel could never have predicted. 3 days later, Daniel received an unexpected call from his grandmother, Margaret Sterling, a woman of grace and quiet wisdom who had watched her grandson build an empire, but lose pieces of his soul along the way. She invited him for tea at her countryside estate, a tradition she had maintained since his childhood. When Daniel arrived, her warmth contrasted sharply with his usual world of formality. "Daniel," she greeted, her voice gentle yet firm, "I hear you're searching for a wife." He gave a tight smile. "A contractual spouse." "The word wife doesn't quite apply," Margaret chuckled softly, pouring tea into delicate china cups. "There's no difference in the law's eyes, dear boy. Only in the heart's." Daniel's gaze hardened. "This isn't about hearts, grandmother. It's about business. You of all people should understand that." "Oh, I understand perfectly," she replied, her tone thoughtful. "That's why I have someone in mind." Daniel raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "You?" "She's a young woman named Emma Rivera. She works at a small cafe near St. Mary's Hospital." Daniel frowned. "A cafe worker? Surely you can't be serious." "I need someone who understands discretion, contracts, expectations." "What you need," Margaret interrupted, "is someone real. Someone who doesn't care about your money or your empire. Emma is kind, strong, and she's been caring for her sick mother for years. Life has taught her humility, something you could stand to learn. He sighed, exasperated. And what makes you think she'd agree to this arrangement? Her mother's treatment costs more than she can afford. She's desperate but not greedy. If she agrees, it won't be for wealth. It will be out of love. And that, Daniel, is the kind of strength your grandfather wanted you to see. Daniel's first instinct was to dismiss the idea entirely, but a small voice, one that sounded inconveniently like his late grandfather's, whispered that perhaps, just this once, he should listen. The following morning, Daniel found himself standing outside Rivera's cafe, a modest little place tucked between a flower shop and a bookstore. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint sound of laughter and clinking dishes. Inside, warmth radiated from every corner, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of his corporate world. Behind the counter, he spotted her. Emma Rivera was not the glamorous type one saw at galas or board meetings. She wore a simple blue dress and a white apron, her chestnut hair tied in a neat ponytail. Yet there was something quietly captivating about her, a light in her brown eyes that spoke of resilience, of someone who had learned to survive storms without losing her kindness. When she noticed him, her expression turned cautious but polite. "Good morning, sir."
Can I help you?
Daniel's voice was smooth but distant. "You're Emma Rivera?" "Yes," she said, studying him carefully. "I'm Daniel Sterling. My grandmother mentioned me." Recognition flickered in her eyes, followed by uncertainty. "She said you wanted to talk about an arrangement," he nodded. "Is there somewhere private we can speak?" Emma hesitated, then led him to a small office in the back of the cafe, a space barely large enough for 2 folding chairs and a desk piled with invoices. The room smelled faintly of coffee beans and vanilla. "I'll be direct," Daniel began, taking a seat. "I need a wife for 30 days. It's a condition in my grandfather's will. In exchange, I'll pay for your mother's full medical treatment, including the surgery she needs, and provide you with a substantial sum after the month ends." Emma's hands trembled slightly, though her voice remained calm. "You make it sound like a business deal." "That's exactly what it is," he replied without hesitation. 30 days. No romance, no expectations. After that, you'll be free." Her eyes searched his face, looking for humanity and finding only precision. "And why me?" she asked softly. "You could have anyone you wanted. Because you don't want anything from me," he said. "That makes you ideal." There was silence. She looked down, torn between pride and desperation. Finally, she whispered, "I have one condition. My mother can't know it's fake. She's been worried about me being alone. If she believes this is real, she'll have peace." For the first time, Daniel's composure faltered. He had expected negotiations about money, not a plea for kindness. He nodded. "Agreed." Her shoulders relaxed just slightly. "Then I accept." The wedding was small and formal, held in the private chapel on the Sterling estate. There were no flowers, no guests, no music, only the quiet echo of vows spoken more out of obligation than affection. Emma wore a simple ivory dress that Margaret insisted on gifting her, while Daniel's suit was as flawless as his expression was empty. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel's handshake replaced what should have been a kiss. Margaret shook her head in disappointment but said nothing. On the drive back to the Sterling mansion, the silence between them was heavy. Emma stared out the window, watching the city fade into lush estates and guarded gates. When the car stopped, she stepped out and froze. The mansion before her was massive, a palace of marble and glass, coldly beautiful but devoid of life. Daniel gestured for the housekeeper, Monica, to assist. "Show Mrs. Sterling to her room." "My room?" Emma asked quietly. "We're not sharing," Daniel said matter-of-factly. "This is a business arrangement. Nothing more." "Of course," she murmured, though her cheeks warmed with embarrassment. Monica, kind and maternal, guided Emma up a grand staircase and into a bedroom larger than any place she had ever lived. The bed alone looked like something out of a dream, soft, elegant, untouched. When Monica left, Emma sat at the edge of it, her heart heavy. The grandeur around her only made her feel smaller. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, 30 days. Just 30 days. Downstairs, Daniel stood before the fireplace in his study, a glass of whiskey in hand, the marriage certificate lying on his desk like a silent accusation. He told himself this meant nothing. It was just another deal, an inconvenience he'd endure to protect his empire. But even as he tried to bury the thought, an image crept back into his mind. Emma's eyes during the ceremony. There had been sadness there, yes, but also quiet strength. The kind that unsettled him because it was so unfamiliar. He finished his drink, staring into the flames. Feelings were weakness, he reminded himself, and this was only business. Yet as the night deepened and the mansion fell silent, somewhere within the emptiness of his heart, something he didn't understand began to stir. The Sterling mansion stood at the edge of the city like a silent monument to power and isolation. Its grand marble pillars and endless corridors spoke of wealth accumulated over generations, yet within its walls there lingered a chill, not from the marble floors or the cold fireplaces, but from the emptiness that came from a life lived without warmth. For Emma Rivera, who had spent her life in small apartments filled with laughter and noise, the silence of the Sterling estate was suffocating. The first night in her new room she could not sleep. She lay beneath silk sheets staring at the ceiling's intricate carvings, feeling like a stranger in someone else's dream. The bed was softer than clouds, yet she felt no comfort. She thought of her mother's smile at the hospital earlier that day, the joy in her eyes when Emma had introduced Daniel as her husband. Her mother had looked at Daniel with such gratitude, thanking him for taking care of her daughter. Emma had smiled through the ache in her chest, knowing the truth she could never tell. Morning came with golden sunlight spilling through the tall windows, but the mansion remained quiet, almost lifeless. When Emma descended the grand staircase, Monica was already setting breakfast in the dining hall, a table so long it could seat 20, though only one end was ever used. Daniel was already there, dressed sharply as always, reading through the day's reports on his tablet. He did not look up when she entered. His voice was clipped, professional. "You're up early." Emma managed a polite nod. "I couldn't sleep. The house feels too big. Most people would call that a luxury," he replied without emotion, his eyes never leaving the screen. "Most people," she said softly, "haven't lived in small spaces filled with love." That made him pause for a brief moment, though he quickly masked it. "You'll get used to it," she smiled faintly. "I'm not sure I want to." For a while, silence filled the room again, broken only by the sound of cutlery against porcelain. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quiet but sincere. "I know this arrangement is just for 30 days, Mr. Sterling, but if we have to pretend in front of others, like your grandmother or my mother, maybe we should at least learn a little about each other. It'll make it believable." Daniel looked up from his tablet, his gray eyes cold but thoughtful. "What exactly do you want to know?" "Something real," she said. "Something that isn't written in the newspapers." He leaned back slightly. "There isn't much to tell. I built this company from the ground up. I manage over 6,000 employees. My days are spent dealing with numbers, deadlines, and people who want something from me. End of story." Emma studied him quietly. "That's not a story, Daniel. That's a resume." Her words, though gentle, struck a chord he didn't want to admit existed. He returned his gaze to the tablet and dismissed the conversation with a curt, "I have a meeting. Monica will show you around." Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and left the dining hall without another word. Emma watched him go, a strange mix of sadness and curiosity stirring in her heart. There was a loneliness in his eyes, buried deep but there. She wondered what kind of pain could make someone build walls that high around their soul. The days that followed were a strange dance of distance and observation. Daniel rose early, left for the city, and returned late, often long after Emma had gone to bed. They crossed paths rarely, at breakfast perhaps, or in the evenings when he'd retreat to his study. Emma, left to navigate the vast emptiness of the mansion, found solace in small acts. She spent hours in the garden, tending to roses that had long been neglected. She explored the massive library, where dust-covered books whispered stories of lives far more passionate than the one she was living. She spoke kindly with Monica and the household staff, her warmth quickly earning their affection. At first, the staff were cautious around her, unsure of how this sudden marriage had come to be, but Emma's kindness melted suspicion. Within days, she had transformed the tone of the household. Laughter returned to corners that had not known it in years. Flowers appeared on dining tables. Music, soft and classical, drifted from the grand piano in the hall. Even Monica confessed one evening, It's been a long time since this house felt alive. Daniel noticed the changes, though he pretended not to. He'd come home late, stepping into a mansion that no longer felt like a cold museum, but something gentler. He would find candles burning softly in the foyer, the faint scent of jasmine lingering in the air, and the echo of Emma's laughter with the staff fading as he entered. He told himself it didn't matter, that it was irrelevant to his life, to his work, to his goals. But the truth was, each night he found it harder to ignore. One evening, he returned home earlier than usual. The board meeting had ended abruptly, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't go to his usual late dinner with clients. As he entered the mansion, he heard music. Curious, he followed the sound to the library and stopped at the door. Emma sat at the grand piano, her fingers gliding gently over the keys, her face illuminated by the golden light of the setting sun. The melody was tender and haunting, a song filled with emotion he couldn't name. She didn't notice him at first, lost in the rhythm. For the first time in years, Daniel felt still. When she finally turned and saw him, she stood quickly. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know you were home." "I can stop." "No," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Don't." She hesitated, surprised by his tone. "You play beautifully," he said after a pause. She smiled shyly. "My mother taught me." She used to say music was the heart speaking when words weren't enough. He nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "I haven't heard music in this house since my parents died." There was a long silence. Emma felt the pain in his voice, quiet, buried, but real. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It was a long time ago," he replied. But his eyes told another story. That night marked the first time Daniel didn't lock himself away in his study. Instead, he joined her in the library, listening as she played soft melodies into the night. They didn't talk much, but something shifted. An invisible wall cracked just enough for the light to slip through. The following week, Daniel's grandmother invited them to a charity gala. "It'll be good for people to see you together," Margaret said with her usual mix of authority and affection. "And it'll give Emma a chance to see your world." Daniel reluctantly agreed, though the thought of public appearances irritated him. Emma, on the other hand, felt nervous but determined. With Monica's help, she chose an elegant navy gown, simple yet breathtaking. When she descended the stairs that evening, Daniel was waiting near the foyer, adjusting his cufflinks. When he looked up and saw her, his composure faltered for the briefest moment. "You look," he began, but stopped himself before the word beautiful could escape. "Appropriate," he finished instead, clearing his throat. Emma smiled, amused. "I'll take that as a compliment." At the gala, the flash of cameras and the hum of whispered curiosity followed them. To the outside world, Daniel Sterling's sudden marriage was a mystery, and many speculated it was a power move, a scandal, or something more secretive. But as Daniel escorted Emma across the marble floor, her calm presence silenced rumors. She was graceful, sincere, and unbothered by judgment. While Daniel mingled with investors and executives, she found herself talking to guests he often ignored. The catering staff, junior associates, and even a janitor taking a short break. Her laughter and kindness drew people in effortlessly. Daniel watched from afar, surprised by how naturally she fit into a world she had never known. For the first time, he saw the difference between being respected and being loved, and he realized he had spent his entire life chasing the wrong one. Later that evening, as they returned home, the car ride was quiet until Emma spoke softly. "Why do you keep everyone at a distance, Daniel?" He frowned. "Because people always want something. Trust makes you weak. Or maybe," she said gently, "you've just met the wrong kind of people." Her words lingered long after the car stopped. As the days turned into weeks, something undeniable began to grow between them. Not spoken, not confessed, but present in every glance, every silence. Daniel found himself noticing things he had never cared to see before. The way Emma smiled when she tended to the garden, the way she read aloud softly when she thought no one was listening, the quiet strength with which she faced each day without complaint. He admired her resilience, though he didn't yet understand it. One evening, a storm rolled through the city, dark clouds swallowing the skyline. Power flickered throughout the mansion, plunging it into half-light. Emma was in the kitchen, helping Monica prepare dinner when Daniel entered, surprisingly without his phone or his tablet. He stood there for a moment, watching her laugh as she tried to fix a dripping candle. When she noticed him, she smiled. "Looks like even your mansion isn't immune to bad weather." He chuckled, an actual laugh, rare and unguarded. "Seems not." They ate together by candlelight, their first real meal as something close to equals. She asked him about his parents, his childhood, his dreams before business consumed him. And for the first time in years, Daniel found himself answering honestly. He told her about losing his parents in a car accident when he was 18, about the emptiness that followed, and how he had filled it with work, control, and perfection. "I thought if I built something great enough, I'd never have to feel powerless again," he admitted quietly. Emma's eyes softened. "You built walls to protect yourself. But sometimes walls don't keep pain out. They just keep love from getting in." Her words were simple, yet they struck deep. For a long moment, Daniel didn't respond. Then he whispered, "You talk like my grandmother." "Then she's a very wise woman," Emma smiled. Outside, thunder rolled, but inside the mansion, warmth returned, not from the candles, but from something that had begun to awaken between them. That night, long after Emma had gone to her room, Daniel remained in the study, staring into the flickering light of the dying fire. The 30 days that once felt like a burden now felt like a countdown to something he couldn't explain. She had entered his life as a contract, a necessity, an obligation. But she had somehow brought light into a place he hadn't realized was dark. He took a deep breath, staring at the marriage certificate still tucked in his desk drawer. What had started as a formality now carried weight he hadn't expected. For the first time in years, Daniel Sterling, the man who believed he could control everything, realized there were some things that couldn't be calculated. And as the storm raged outside, one undeniable truth took root in his heart. Something was changing. He didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he wanted to find out. The days moved like quiet tides within the walls of the Sterling mansion, and with each sunrise, something subtle but undeniable began to shift. Between Daniel and Emma, what had begun as a mere arrangement, a cold contract, written in ink and indifference, had started to take on the shape of something neither of them dared to name. Daniel found himself noticing the small things that had once seemed irrelevant. The way Emma hummed softly while making tea in the mornings, the quiet gratitude in her eyes when he remembered to ask about her mother's health, the strength with which she faced every challenge, even when exhaustion painted shadows beneath her eyes. For the first time in years, Daniel found himself lingering at the breakfast table, engaging in small conversations, even if they started awkwardly. Emma had become a quiet presence in his once empty home. And though he would not admit it aloud, the silence that used to comfort him now felt unbearable when she wasn't around. Emma, too, had noticed changes in him. The stern businessman who once treated her like an accessory to a deal now showed traces of something human, something tender. He would pause before speaking, his tone softer, his words less guarded. Sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she'd catch him watching her as if trying to understand something about her that defied all his logic. Yet beneath the growing connection, both of them carried fears they couldn't voice. She feared that the illusion would end the moment their 30 days were over, while he feared that the moment he acknowledged his feelings, he would lose the control that had defined his entire life. It was on the 12th day of their marriage when the illusion of peace began to tremble. Emma received a call from the hospital. Her mother's condition had worsened overnight. The words of the doctor were gentle but heavy, like stones sinking into her chest. Heart complications, sudden deterioration, the need for another procedure. Phrases that made the world blur around her. When Daniel came home that evening, he found her sitting in the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her trembling hands. Her face was pale, her eyes red, yet she did not cry. She had always believed that breaking down would make her weaker, and weakness was something she couldn't afford. Daniel approached carefully. "Emma?" he said softly. She looked up, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It's my mother. They're saying she needs another surgery. I thought the last one would help her recover, but..." Her voice broke for the first time and she turned away. "They said it's risky, and even with it, there's no guarantee." Without thinking, Daniel stepped closer. He wasn't used to comforting anyone. Empathy was a language foreign to him. Yet seeing her like that, and so small, so fragile, something inside him cracked. "I'll call the hospital," he said firmly. "We'll get her the best surgeon, whatever it costs." Emma shook her head weakly. It's not about the money this time. It's about time. They said if it doesn't happen soon, we might not have another chance. I'll make it happen tonight, Daniel replied, already reaching for his phone. His voice carried the same authority that had once built empires, but now it was driven by something entirely different, a desperate need to protect. Within hours, his influence had moved through the medical board, ensuring Emma's mother was in the best care possible. He stayed at the hospital with her that night, quietly watching as she sat beside her mother's bed, holding her hand and whispering softly. He had never seen such devotion, a kind of love that asked for nothing in return. It was close to midnight when Emma stepped outside to the hospital garden, her exhaustion etched deep in her face. The air was cold, the city lights distant, and she stood there silently until she heard footsteps behind her. Daniel joined her without a word. They stood together for a long time, the quiet between them speaking louder than any conversation. Finally, she said softly, "You didn't have to stay." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I wanted to." She met his gaze, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. For a moment, the distance between them felt like it could dissolve into something real, but before she could say anything, he looked away. "You should get some rest," he said quietly. She smiled faintly, a tired, grateful smile. "You too, Mr. Sterling." When he drove her home that night, the car was silent, but it was a different kind of silence, one filled with understanding instead of emptiness. When they reached the mansion, she thanked him before going upstairs, but Daniel didn't move for a long time. He sat in the car, staring at the house that once symbolized power, but now felt like a cage holding him captive between who he was and who he was becoming. The following days passed in a blur of hospital visits and long nights. Emma spent every spare hour with her mother, while Daniel quietly took care of logistics behind the scenes, transferring funds, hiring specialists, even ensuring that Emma's cafe job was protected in her absence. He told himself he was simply fulfilling his end of the agreement, but deep down, he knew it was more. He wanted to help because he couldn't bear to see her in pain, and though he never said it aloud, he admired her resilience more than anything. One evening, when Emma returned from the hospital exhausted, she found a soft light glowing from the dining hall. The table was set, not with the usual formal spread, but something simple and warm. Daniel stood near the fireplace, hands in his pockets, his posture almost uncertain. "You haven't eaten properly in days," he said quietly. "I thought you might join me." Emma blinked, stunned. "You cooked?" He gave a half smile. "I ordered. But I did pour the wine myself. That counts for something." She laughed softly, and for the first time in weeks, the sound felt genuine. They ate together, and the conversation came easier than either expected. They talked about her childhood, his favorite books, the places he had traveled, and the ones he had never dared to visit. At one point, he admitted he hadn't taken a vacation in over 10 years. She looked at him with disbelief. "You built an empire, Daniel. But when was the last time you actually lived?" He met her gaze, and for once he didn't have an answer. Later that night, when they stood at the doorway, she turned to him and said softly, "You're not as cold as you pretend to be." He looked away, almost smiling. "Don't tell anyone. It would ruin my reputation." That night, Daniel found himself lying awake, thinking about her words. He had built a life on the foundation of logic, control, and detachment. Yet a woman who entered his world by accident had managed to pull at threads he thought were buried forever. A week later, a quiet evening brought an unexpected storm. Daniel returned home early to find Emma sitting in the library, surrounded by books. The rain lashed against the windows and thunder rumbled in the distance. She looked up as he entered, a small smile touching her lips. "It's strange," she said softly. "This place doesn't feel so cold anymore." "That's your doing," he replied, stepping closer. "You've brought life into this house again." She closed the book gently, her eyes meeting his. Maybe it just needed someone to remind it that life is still worth living. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them was charged with something fragile and profound. He reached for the book she'd been reading, a collection of poetry. "You like this kind of thing?" She nodded. "Poetry makes me feel things I can't always explain. It's like finding truth in someone else's words." He glanced at the page she had left open. "Do you believe in love, Emma?" She hesitated, her voice trembling slightly. I believe in kindness and connection. Love, I'm not sure. Maybe it's not something to believe in, but something to become. Her words echoed in his mind, pulling something raw from within him. Before he could think, he spoke. You've changed me. She looked up, startled. Daniel. He shook his head slightly as if realizing what he had said, and took a small step back. Forget it. It's late. She rose slowly, her heart racing, her thoughts a storm of their own. Daniel, she said gently, you don't have to run from what you feel. Sometimes it's okay to be human. Her honesty disarmed him more than anger ever could. He turned to her, his voice quiet but heavy with meaning. You don't know what it's like to lose everything and still be expected to be strong. To wake up every day and pretend you're fine because weakness isn't allowed. Emma took a step forward. Then maybe you've never had someone who told you it's okay not to be fine. For a moment, their eyes locked. The kind of gaze that carried every unspoken word between two souls who had lived too long in silence. The rain outside grew heavier, but inside, the world felt suspended in stillness. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. You're not alone anymore, Daniel. He didn't reply. But when she left the room, he stood there long after, his heart pounding like a man realizing he had been asleep for years and had finally woken up. That night, Daniel walked the halls of his mansion, halls that once echoed with nothing but ambition, and felt something unfamiliar. Gratitude. For the first time, he was thankful for the clause in his grandfather's will, for the chance meeting with a woman who saw through his armor. Yet with that gratitude came fear. Because for all his power, he couldn't control what he was beginning to feel. He had built his life on certainty, and love was the one thing that refused to be measured, contained or predicted. As he stood before the fireplace, staring into the flames, he realized something profound. He didn't just care for Emma, he needed her. Not because she filled a void, but because she reminded him that life wasn't meant to be survived. It was meant to be felt. And as the thunder rolled across the night sky, Daniel Sterling, the man who once despised the very idea of marriage, finally understood that his 30-day contract had become something far greater than either of them could have foreseen. The days ahead would test that truth in ways neither could imagine. But for now, as rain whispered against the windows, Daniel allowed himself to feel what he had long denied. And in that fragile moment, his heart, once made of stone, began to truly beat again. The 22nd day of the 30-day marriage began with a gray sky hanging low over the Sterling estate. Clouds gathered like silent witnesses to a storm that had nothing to do with the weather. Daniel Sterling had spent the early hours pacing his study, his thoughts tangled in confusion. For a man who prided himself on control, his emotions had become unpredictable, impossible to categorize or contain. The realization terrified him. He had fallen for Emma, quietly, completely, and without permission. The woman he had once regarded as a temporary solution had somehow become the very heartbeat of his world. Yet the more he cared, the more fear crept in. Love, he believed, was a liability. It made men foolish, vulnerable, and weak. And Daniel had built his life on never allowing anyone that kind of power over him. He had tried to keep his distance in the days following the storm, convincing himself that space would restore logic. But every time he caught sight of Emma, every time her laughter drifted through the mansion or her gentle voice filled a room, all his resolve unraveled. He admired her courage, her warmth, and the quiet dignity with which she carried burdens that would have broken others. When she smiled at him now, he felt something stir in his chest. Not the shallow satisfaction of victory or success, but the aching pull of a heart rediscovering its humanity. Yet life, as always, had its own cruel timing. That morning, as Daniel reviewed documents in his office, his phone rang. A number from the hospital. The voice on the other end was calm but grave. Emma's mother had suffered a cardiac arrest. They were doing everything they could, but her condition was critical. Daniel froze, the words echoing in his mind before he bolted from his chair and ran down the hall. Emma was already standing near the door when he arrived, pale, trembling, her eyes wide with fear. "It's Mom," she whispered, barely able to breathe. "They said she—" "I know," he said quickly, his voice uncharacteristically unsteady. "Come on, we're going now." The drive to the hospital felt endless. Rain had begun to fall again, streaking against the windshield as if the heavens themselves wept. Emma sat beside him in silence, clutching her hands together, her lips moving in prayer. Daniel kept glancing at her, wishing he could promise that everything would be fine, but even his power had limits. When they reached the hospital, she ran inside before he could park. He followed moments later, his usual composure stripped away. They found her mother in the intensive care unit, pale and fragile beneath the white sheets. Surrounded by machines that hummed and beeped rhythmically, Emma stood frozen at the foot of the bed before stepping forward, her voice breaking as she called softly, "Mom, I'm here." Daniel stood by the door, helpless, watching as the woman who had raised Emma, who had smiled at him so warmly weeks ago, lay fighting for her life. The doctors explained the situation with clinical precision, but Daniel heard little beyond the echo of one phrase. "It may only be a matter of hours." Emma turned to him then, her face streaked with tears. "Daniel, I can't lose her," she whispered, and that was all it took for him to cross the room and pull her into his arms. She buried her face against his chest, sobbing quietly, and for the first time in his life, Daniel didn't try to fix the unfixable. He simply held her, feeling her pain as though it were his own. Hours passed like years. They sat together in silence, hands intertwined, the beeping of monitors filling the air. Every rise and fall of her mother's chest became a desperate prayer. And then as dawn began to break, the rhythm faltered. The doctors rushed in, their voices urgent, but within minutes the inevitable truth fell upon them like a stone. Emma's mother was gone. Emma did not scream. She did not faint. She simply stood there, her eyes blank, as if her soul had slipped away with the woman on the bed. Daniel watched in horror, his heart breaking for her. He had faced hostile takeovers, financial ruin, public scandal, but nothing had ever made him feel so utterly powerless. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away gently, whispering, "I just need a moment." She stepped outside the room and sank onto a bench in the corridor. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above her, harsh and cold. She stared at the floor, her mind replaying memories, laughter in the kitchen, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of her mother's lullabies when nights were long and uncertain. All of it gone, vanished into silence. Daniel approached carefully, kneeling in front of her. "Emma," he began, but his voice faltered. He wanted to say something that could take the pain away, but there were no words powerful enough. Finally, she looked up, her eyes glistening with quiet devastation. "You did everything you could," she said softly. "Thank you for that. But some things even you can't fix." He nodded, his throat tight. "I know, but I can stay. You don't have to face this alone." Her lips trembled. "You don't have to stay out of obligation." "I'm not here out of obligation," he said firmly. "I'm here because I care." Something in his tone, raw and unguarded, broke through her numbness. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, tears spilled freely. He sat beside her, took her hand again, and this time she didn't pull away. They sat like that for a long while, two souls who had both lost too much, finding solace in the quiet presence of one another. The funeral took place 3 days later, a simple ceremony filled with soft music and whispered prayers. Emma stood by the grave dressed in black, her face pale but composed. Daniel stood beside her, silent, protective, a constant anchor in a world that had suddenly lost its center. When the final words were spoken, she placed a white rose atop the casket, her hand trembling slightly. "Goodbye, Mom," she whispered. "I'll be okay. I promise." After the service, Daniel drove her home. The ride was quiet, not from discomfort but from mutual understanding. When they reached the mansion, Emma went straight to the garden, the one she had brought back to life with her care. She stood among the roses, staring at the blooms glistening with dew. Daniel followed her slowly, unsure whether to speak. She finally turned, her voice steady but distant. "You know, I used to think strength meant pretending everything was fine. But I realize now that real strength is learning to fall apart and still stand back up." Daniel nodded. "Your mother would be proud of you." Her eyes filled with tears again, and she took a deep breath. "She always told me that love is the only thing that outlives death. I used to think she meant faith, but now I think she meant kindness. The kind that changes people even when they don't want to change." He felt her words pierce deep, striking a part of him that had long been buried. "You've changed me, Emma," he confessed quietly. More than you'll ever know. For the first time, she didn't look away. Then promise me you won't go back to being who you were before this. He hesitated. I don't think I could, even if I tried. That night, Daniel sat alone in his study, the house once again silent. But the silence felt different now, heavier, lonelier. He stared at the marriage certificate that had once been a symbol of business survival, and realized how meaningless the paper was compared to what had grown between them. The 30 days were nearly over, yet the thought of it ending made his chest ache. He didn't want her to leave. He didn't want to return to a life defined by loneliness and transactions. He rose and walked to the window. The garden below was illuminated by moonlight, and there she was, sitting on the stone bench, lost in thought. Without hesitation, he went to her. Emma looked up as he approached. Her face was calm, her eyes soft but weary. Couldn't sleep? She asked quietly. Not without talking to you, he admitted. He sat beside her, the cool night air wrapping around them. Emma, I don't know how to say this without sounding clumsy, but these past weeks, they've changed everything for me. She listened, her expression unreadable. When we started this, I thought I was doing you a favor, he continued. I thought I was saving my company, but somewhere along the way I realized you were the one saving me. Her lips parted slightly, her heart pounding in her chest. He took a breath. I know I don't deserve it, but I care about you. More than I've ever cared about anyone. And when this month ends, I don't want it to end with you walking away. The silence that followed was long and heavy. Emma looked at him, tears glimmering in her eyes, but her voice was steady. Daniel, I don't know what the future holds, but right now I need time to heal. Losing my mother. It feels like I've lost a part of myself. I can't give you an answer tonight. He nodded slowly, understanding. I'll wait. For as long as it takes. She reached out then, placing her hand gently over his. You don't have to wait out of guilt or loneliness. I'm not, he said, his voice firm but tender. I'm waiting because for the first time in my life, I finally know what matters. The moonlight shimmered on the tears that escaped down her cheeks, and she whispered, Then maybe there's hope for both of us. They sat together beneath the vast night sky, two broken hearts learning that love is not found in perfection, but in the courage to begin again after loss. And though grief lingered in the air like the scent of rain, something new and fragile was blooming in its place, something worth holding on to. The 30-day clock continued to tick, but neither of them counted the days anymore. For the first time, they were no longer living by a contract. They were simply living, together, uncertain, but finally real. The 30th day arrived quietly, without warning, as though time itself had been holding its breath. The mansion stood calm under the soft glow of morning light, its walls no longer feeling like a cage but like a sanctuary that had learned how to breathe again. Daniel Sterling sat by the large window of his study, staring out at the garden where the roses Emma had planted now bloomed in full color. A month ago he would have seen only flowers, symbols of maintenance and aesthetics. Now he saw life, resilience, and love reflected in every petal. And in that reflection he saw her. The contract they had signed was meant to end that day. 30 days of pretending, 30 days of formality, 30 days to protect his empire. But as he sat there, the paper now felt meaningless, the empire suddenly small. He realized the very thing he once feared most, emotional attachment, had become the only thing he truly valued. Downstairs, Emma stood in the quiet kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. The grief of her mother's death still lingered, woven into the edges of her days. But Daniel's presence had made the pain bearable. He had stood beside her not as a savior, but as a man who had learned how to listen, how to care, how to be human again. And in his transformation, she had found her own. Yet the weight of the ending hung heavy between them. The marriage had started as an arrangement, and though love had quietly replaced obligation, she knew the terms of the contract still existed. And she wasn't sure if his heart was stronger than the walls he had spent years building. As she gazed out toward the garden, she heard footsteps behind her. Daniel entered the room, dressed in his usual tailored perfection, yet there was something different about him, a calmness that came not from control, but from acceptance. Morning, he said softly. She smiled faintly. Morning. For a while, neither spoke. The air between them carried a quiet that was not cold but fragile, like a truth waiting to be spoken. Finally, Daniel broke it. It's the 30th day, he said, his voice steady but low. Emma nodded. I know. I was supposed to go to Vincent today, he continued, his eyes meeting hers. He's expecting me to sign the final papers, to confirm the dissolution of our marriage and restore full ownership of the company. And will you? She asked gently. He took a slow breath. That's what I came here to talk about. She looked at him, her expression calm but searching. Daniel, whatever you decide, I'll understand. This was never supposed to be forever. He shook his head slightly, a faint smile touching his lips. That's the thing, Emma. For the first time in my life, I don't want something temporary. You came into my life because of a contract, but you've become the one thing I can't imagine living without. Her heart clenched at his words, but fear shadowed her eyes. Daniel, don't say that because you feel responsible for me. You've done more than enough. He stepped closer, his tone firm yet tender. I'm not saying it out of guilt. I'm saying it because it's true. You've changed me. Before you, I knew how to build empires, but I didn't know how to build a life. You taught me that success without love is just loneliness dressed in gold. She looked down, tears gathering in her eyes. You're not the same man I met 30 days ago. He smiled sadly. No, I'm not. Because of you. The words hung in the air, fragile and sincere. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his hand. Daniel, I don't know if I'm ready to start over. I'm still healing, still learning how to live without my mother. I know, he said softly, and I'll wait. Not out of obligation, not out of pity, but because I believe in what we've built, even if it takes time. Emma swallowed hard, emotions flooding her heart. And what about your company? The board, your legacy? He exhaled, almost smiling. If keeping the company means losing the one person who taught me what it means to truly live, then maybe it's time I redefine what legacy really means. That was when she realized he had already made his decision. Later that afternoon, Daniel met with Vincent in his office. The older man looked surprised when Daniel handed him the papers. You're not renewing the clause? Vincent asked, his brow furrowed. If you end the marriage, you risk losing controlling interest. The board is already— I'm aware, Daniel interrupted calmly. File whatever's necessary. I'll step down if I have to. Vincent stared at him, stunned. Daniel, are you sure about this? Yes, he said firmly. Some things are worth more than control. When Daniel returned to the mansion that evening, Emma was sitting on the steps of the garden, her hair catching the orange glow of sunset. He walked toward her slowly, his heart steady, his mind clear. It's done, he said quietly when he reached her. She looked up, confused. What's done? I gave it up. The company, the control, the clause doesn't matter anymore. Her eyes widened in disbelief. You gave up everything? He shook his head with a soft smile. No, Emma. I finally gained something. Freedom. Peace. A chance to live honestly. Tears welled in her eyes as she rose to her feet. Why would you do that? Because I realized that love isn't weakness, he said, stepping closer. It's the only thing strong enough to make a man surrender his pride. She covered her mouth, her heart breaking open under the weight of his sincerity. Daniel. He reached out and gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing away her tears. You once told me love isn't something to believe in. It's something to become. You were right. You became it, Emma, and I want to spend the rest of my life learning how to become it too. For a long moment they stood there, the world fading into silence around them. Then, without hesitation, she stepped into his arms. The embrace was not the desperate clutch of two lost souls, but the steady promise of two people who had finally found home in each other. The wind rustled through the roses, scattering petals like blessings. Above them, the sky stretched wide and golden, as if the universe itself had paused to witness their transformation. Weeks passed, and though the business world buzzed with rumors of Daniel Sterling's unexpected resignation, he paid them no mind. The man who had once measured worth in numbers now measured his days by laughter, warmth, and quiet mornings shared, over coffee with the woman who had taught him everything success could not. Emma began volunteering at a local foundation for heart patients in honor of her mother, while Daniel used his wealth to support charitable hospitals, instead of chasing profit margins. They lived simply, not in grandeur, but in grace. One evening, as they sat together on the garden bench beneath a sky full of stars, Emma turned to him, her eyes glowing with peace. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly. "The power, the meetings, the control?" Daniel smiled, gazing at her hand resting in his. "Once upon a time, that was all I thought I needed. But now, this is what control really feels like. Being free enough to choose love over fear." She smiled through her tears, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Your grandfather would be proud." He nodded, his voice a whisper. "Maybe, but I think he'd say the real inheritance was never the company. It was the lesson." They sat, in silence, the night embracing them, the roses swaying gently in the breeze. The mansion that had once been built of cold ambition now echoed with laughter, music, and life, the kind that cannot be bought or measured. And as the stars shimmered above them, Daniel realized that the true miracle wasn't in the fortune he had saved or the empire he had built, but in the woman who had walked into his world for 30 days and stayed to change it forever. Years later, when people spoke of Daniel Sterling, they didn't talk about his wealth or his empire. They talked about how a powerful man had given up everything to keep his heart alive, and how a woman named Emma Rivera had taught him that sometimes love isn't a grand declaration. It's the quiet act of staying, of believing, of healing together. Their story became a quiet legend, not one of scandal or success, but of redemption. And those who heard it would always remember the man who once despised love but learned to worship it, and the woman who taught him that even the coldest hearts can bloom again.